Good evening, everybody. Welcome to our Digital Leadership Series event featuring Erik Brynjolfsson. I'm delighted to welcome you all to the session on the AI awakening. Let me start with a little bit of context before I welcome Erik. For a long time, Robert Solow, a Nobel laureate economist, said many, many years ago, we can see computers everywhere but in the productivity statistics. And that has generally been true for many years, with the exception of the internet boom. We saw a rapid rise in productivity during that period. And then we've had relatively modest period before and after the internet boom years. Erik Brynjolfsson has studied productivity and technology for longer than pretty much anybody on the planet. He is the foremost expert in this subject area. And he is now very optimistic about the potential impact of artificial intelligence on productivity and on growth. In fact, we've had a couple of really good quarters of economic growth and productivity increases. So what we've asked Erik to talk about today is some explanations for what happened in the past, what he sees happening in the future, and how companies can capitalize on the potential of artificial intelligence, and in particular in technology more broadly. Before I turn the floor over to Erik, just a couple of housekeeping notes. One, we will take questions through the Q&A feature, not through the chat session, which has been disabled. So please enter your questions. We will get to them in the last 15 or 20 minutes of the session. Erik's going to talk for about 20 to 25 minutes. I'm going to talk to him for about 10 minutes, and then we'll open the floor to all of you. But please feel free to type in your questions as and when they arise in your brains, of course. Let me also make it a point to thank our sponsors who make it possible for all of us to attend these sessions at no cost to you. And that is KPMG and Kalpana Ramakrishnan, managing partner for Orange County and on the board of KPMG in particular, and also the Beal Family Foundation, who have been both of whom have been supporting us for many years. So thank you all for attending. And I'm particularly pleased, it's a little weird because I can't see any of you, though you can see me. And it's just wonderful to see so many of my past students, my colleagues from across the country attend this session with Erik. Erik is the Jerry Yang and Akiko Yamazaki Professor and Senior Fellow at Stanford, where he's the Director of the Stanford Digital Economy Lab. He holds joint appointments at the Graduate School of Business, the Stanford Department of Economics, and is generally sort of the foremost, like I said earlier, academic expert on the role of technology and on the study of technology and productivity. Erik's also been a friend for a very long time, so it's a personal pleasure to welcome him to our forum with that. We're looking forward to the work that you build at the Digital Economy Lab over the next few years. So thank you again for joining us, Erik, and over to you.
Thanks, Vijay. It's a real pleasure to be here. I'm very much looking forward to having a chance to share some of the research we've been doing since I was at MIT about a year ago, and now over at Stanford, the Digital Economy Lab. And a lot of it connects with some of the things that Vijay and I worked together, I hate to say it, but over 20 years ago, back in the 1990s, on some stuff, and earlier than that, even when I was a grad student. So it's good to continue that theme. And I look forward to hearing the questions and comments you all have. So let me just get the title slide up here. And I hope everyone can see that. As Vijay mentioned, I'll be talking about the AI awakening and what it means for productivity and the future of work. This is something I've been working on for a long time, but I believe we're in the early stages of a major transformation of work. You could call it a digital transformation, like your center. And it rivals some of the things we've seen in the past, or maybe surpasses some of the things with the steam engine and electricity and some of the other earlier general purpose technologies. Now, one of the reasons I'm so excited, and one of the reasons I actually came to California and Stanford and Silicon Valley, is because this technology is really doing something pretty remarkable. And I hope, let's go back there. We're seeing progress quite rapid in machine learning systems, especially in those that are using deep learning techniques. For instance, here's a chart of data from recognizing images on ImageNet that my colleague at Stanford, Fei-Fei Li, put together, about 14 million images. And what you see is around 2012, it started getting dramatically better. That's when Jeff Hinton and others started using deep learning techniques. These are very large neural networks. And to the point where now it's actually surpassing humans in recognizing objects. Whether that's an antelope or a gazelle, I'm not sure I could tell, but the machines can recognize these things very well. I don't want to say that machines are better than humans in all vision tasks, but in certain categories, they have gotten better where you have enough training data. And this has affected many different areas, not just these puzzles, but also you've probably noticed on Facebook and other social media, they can recognize your friends' faces. And medical diagnosis, radiologists and others are able to have machines help them a lot with diagnosing cancer and other diseases based on medical images. Now, when a machine crosses that threshold and starts getting better than a human, if you're an entrepreneur or a manager, you have a choice. Do you want to use the second best solution or the best solution? So it's kind of an important threshold when machines are able to do things better. And it's not just image recognition. Most of you probably use some sort of a voice recognition system. We know it's far from perfect, but we're in this interesting 10-year period where we went from really not being able to talk to our machines to beginning to routinely talk to them. And there are so many other categories. Andy McAfee and I described many of these in an article in Harvard Business Review. Basically, any time you have some data that can be described as an input and output that can also be described with data, then the machine can find the mapping between those two data sets. And there's basically a gold rush going on right now to trying to find more and more of those opportunities. I'm sure in your organizations, there are many such opportunities that map from one to the other. And that this article gives some criteria for finding those opportunities. Let me talk a bit about the economic implications of that. So in particular, there are a couple of big ones that I want to talk about. First is what it means for productivity, as Vijay said. And secondly, the future of work and the way that work is being transformed. So there's a bit of a puzzle right now, as Vijay hinted at, that although AI is very impressive, I'm certainly amazed at what it can do in many different categories. We could talk more about the technology. The data on productivity is pretty dismal. Other than that boom that Vijay described, since then, since the early 2000s, productivity has been pretty dismal, growing only 1.3% per year, less than half the rate it did earlier. So despite great technologies, we're having slow productivity growth. And it's not just the United States. This is happening in all the OECD countries, well, except for Greece, which started off so slow, they didn't have much room to go down. So what's going on? Well, one hypothesis is that we're just not measuring it right. And many of my friends here in Silicon Valley, they really want to emphasize that there are a lot of benefits from digital technologies that just don't show up in the productivity statistics or the economic statistics more broadly. GDP, a great invention by Simon Kuznets over about 100 years ago, is great at measuring production and output, but it only counts things that have that are bought and sold in the economy, or almost only counts those. So if something has a zero price, it's likely that it has zero weight in GDP. And not only that, productivity is defined as GDP divided by hours worked. So if you mismeasure the numerator, GDP, you're going to mismeasure productivity just as much. But what we've seen is that there's been an explosion of free digital goods, like Wikipedia and LinkedIn and the Zoom that we're on right now. And so I don't have any doubt that there's a lot more of these goods than before. If you look at the official statistics, however, GDP has barely buzzed. It moved from 4.7% in the early 80s to about 4.7% later. Information goods is a share of GDP. So it's like all these information goods really didn't move the dial much at all on what's happening to GDP. Now, that's not because they don't exist or they're not important or they don't have value. It's just because we're not measuring them as part of GDP. So we need a new measure. And that's what my team has been working on. Avi Collis and Erwin Dewart and Kevin Fox and I have been working on a project to better measure the value of free and new goods. And our metric is called GDPB because what we seek to do is measure the benefits, not the costs of these goods. In that way, it's a little bit like regular GDP. It has very detailed, we go through each particular type of good, Wikipedia, Facebook, jet travel, and we try to measure how much value consumers are getting from it. Quite detailed. I can't say it's got the precision of GDP, which can be measured out to 9 significant digits, but we can measure it fairly precisely. But it's more relevant to well-being than some of the than GDP is. You could argue that just measuring happiness would be the most relevant one, but that can't be done with a great deal of precision, maybe on a scale of 1 to 10 or 1 to 5 or something like that. But there's a series of papers that describe in more detail how we are going about measuring it. And my hope is that over the next few years, we'll stand up a parallel set of accounts next to GDP, where GDP-B measures the benefits as opposed to the production costs of these goods and services. And this is important because as we teach our MBAs, you can't measure what you can't manage what you don't measure. And so we need to have better metrics. Where right now, whether you're a congressman or the Federal Reserve, if you're missing a big part of the economy, the whole digital economy, you're going to make the wrong decisions. The same thing is true for CEOs and managers and executives. So we want to give them better data. But the other reason that we are having a productivity mismatch and productivity slowdown is that it takes time to implement these technologies. So however wondrous AI is, by and large, it hasn't really been incorporated into companies' businesses as much as it needs to be, and it will be over time. And this in a way is no different than what happened with electricity, where it took about 20 to 30 years before you started seeing big productivity gains because factories had to be reinvented. Same with the steam engine, same with automobiles and other powerful technologies. In fact, our research shows that for every dollar of technology investment like AI, there are another $9 or $10 of investment needed in business processes and human capital. And those intangible investments are often much more important, much more difficult, much more time consuming than the technology investment itself. They often go unseen because they don't necessarily show up in the balance sheet the same way. If you have a change in business processes, there's no real place to record that in most accounting systems, but it may be more important than just the technology per se. Working with Daniel Rock and Lauren Hitt and Sunny Tambe, we've been seeking to measure those intangibles more carefully, looking, for instance, at property, plant, and equipment compared to market value. And what we find is the digital capital, that is the intangibles associated with digital technologies, has been growing very rapidly. It's the red or orange part here. Traditional types of capital have also been growing, but you can see that digital capital went from essentially 0 to about 25% of the value of all capital. So it's getting to be a bigger and bigger share in the economy. And it's not at all evenly distributed. The top 10% of firms account for the vast majority of it. The next 10% a little bit, but the bottom 80% really haven't had any significant digital capital investment since the late 1990s. It's all happening in just a small subset of firms. So we're seeing these superstar firms in every industry pull away. This chart, by the way, doesn't include Facebook and Google and the other very popular digital firms. This is just firms that have been around since the 1990s. If you were to include those digital mega firms, that it would be even more extreme than what I'm showing here. The implication is that as these companies are investing in these intangible digital technologies, initially it doesn't translate immediately into a productivity gain. In fact, what we get is what's called a productivity J curve. At first, you're making a lot of investments. You're trying to figure out how self-driving cars work. You're trying to reorganize your retail center. You're inventing new kinds of factory operations, et cetera. That's timely and takes a lot of costs, and it requires new skill development as well. And during that period, costs are going up, but no output is being produced. There's, as far as I know, there's no chauffeurs who have lost their jobs to a driverless car. But over time, those technologies do start to pay off and do transform output. And in that second wave, you get the upward part of the J curve, and then productivity gets higher and performance gets higher than what it was initially. My sense is we are just at that turning point of the J curve. We've gone through the worst of it and we're beginning to come up. And as we start coming up, productivity will start getting a lot better. Now, it's not just productivity, but it's also the transformation of work that's very important. And let me spend a few minutes talking about that. When most people think about how technology is driving wages, they think of basically one thing. Let's substitute a piece of capital or technology for a worker. And so we get a substitution effect driving down wages. But a more careful analysis, like the one I did with Tom Mitchell, indicates that there are at least 6 different ways that technology can affect wages. In fact, it can complement it and lead to higher wages For instance, jet engines make pilots more valuable. We have more pilots than before, and they're more productive, and they're getting paid more than they did in Orville and Wilbur Wright's day, or even in the 1940s or 1960s. And that's because this technology has amplified their abilities. And through most of history, that kind of amplification has been the main story, and wages have generally gotten higher. But it's not the only way, and in the paper we describe other ways. We can also look at which types of tasks are most affected by machine learning. And Tom Mitchell and I dove in a little bit more deeply with that, also working with Daniel Rock. And what we found was that for most occupations, machine learning can have a big effect on some of the tasks, but not all of the tasks. For instance, radiologists do about 27 distinct tasks, according to ONET. And if you dive in, some of them, like interpreting medical images, score very high. They're likely to be done by machine learning systems. But others, like for instance, administering sedation or conducting physical exams or making treatment plans, these are things that machine learning does not do well at all. So even though many people have said that radiology is going to be replaced by machine learning, a closer look reveals that only part of what they do is going to be done by machine learning. And an important part, I want to be clear, but this pattern is something we found across the board. We looked at over 950 distinct occupations. And for almost all of them, we found that machine learning would have some effect, would affect some of the tasks. But for none of them, not a single one of the 950, did we find that machine learning ran the table and was able to do all of the tasks. So my takeaway is that, yes, we'll have big radical restructuring of work and reorganization of jobs, but we're not going to see mass joblessness as a machine goes in and does the entire job. The numbers are large. The effects will be pretty big. Our estimate is about $700 billion of value can be done with just the 90th percentile, the easiest things that are done by machine learning. So this is the ones that are very ripe. And that went backwards. The other thing is that it's going to be fairly uneven, and some folks are going to be affected a lot more than others. The overall pie, I'm confident, was going to get significantly bigger, but some people will gain a lot and others may even fall behind. For instance, if you were to look at a number of different occupations, these are the 950 occupations I mentioned earlier, you see a pattern. Let's lay them out on the x-axis based on what their wages are, the lowest wages to the right and the top percentile on the right. Sorry, the lowest wage on the left and the top percentile on the right. And on the vertical axis is what we call the SML score, how suitable the tasks are for machine learning. And you can see a downward slope. There are jobs like cashier, which have relatively low wages, and also a lot of them can be done well by machines. In fact, you've probably been in some supermarkets where the machines are doing most of what a checkout person used to do. So those have been largely automated, although there are still people needed for parts of those jobs. There are some high-paid jobs that are also pretty vulnerable. For instance, pilots scored very high. Many of their tasks can be done by machines. They're also among the highest paid people. And when I did this chart, I couldn't help peeking Vijay at what economists are. And so paid, maybe not as much as some people think, as some economists would like, but paid pretty decently, I'd say. But most of the tasks are not that suitable for machine learning. Some of them certainly are. You can also analyze large numbers of job postings to get more detailed analysis. Instead of the 950 jobs, we've started using machine learning techniques to look at over 200 million job postings and analyze the full text of them and convert that text into a vector so we can see with numbers how different jobs relate to each other in a space. Some jobs are near each other, some are far away from each other. And by doing that, we start understanding the broader trends in the economy. We can also roll them up to an entire company and see, looking at the jobs in one company, compare them to jobs in the other company, how vulnerable are they and how are they likely to change over time? For instance, here's a chart. Let's look at the scatter plot on the right. The little red dart is Walmart, and it's fairly high up, about more than halfway up the chart, which means that a lot of the tasks at Walmart can be done by machine learning. Its suitability for machine learning score is high. They have 2.5 million workers, and most of them have big parts of their jobs that can be automated. So they're kind of in the bullseye of a coming revolution that's going to transform their work. They're also kind of further to the right than most of their other firms, the blue firms in the retail industry or the black firms in all of the economy. And what that means is that they have more skills than AI-related skills. They have more people who understand Python and TensorFlow, more data scientists, more people who have cloud services expertise. So they're positioned to help with that transition. They're vulnerable, but they also have a lot of the skills. And we can do a lot of these analyses now that we have this kind of very detailed data. We can dive in more deeply and kind of create a dashboard for every company to understand what's going on. And Andy McAfee and I have started a company called WorkHelix that allows us to understand the companies in a little bit more detail and compare them to their competitors. So let me just sum up. I'm looking forward to your questions and comments. You can put them into the Q&A, as Vijay mentioned. But there are three main takeaways. The first one is that these powerful digital technologies are already available. They're already at superhuman levels in many cases. And so we're on the verge of a real technological revolution. And I'm pretty excited by that. But while technology is cool, it's not enough to boost productivity. What we find is that you need to reorganize your business processes, come up with new business models, retrain your workforce or hire new people who have the right set of skills. That actually is much more costly than just the technology. It's also much more time consuming. So you need to make the investments in that. As you make those costly investments, you get what's called a productivity J curve that takes some time to translate into a productivity boom. And thirdly, successful firms will be those that have the skills that are needed for the future. We can separate at the top 10% of firms that are pulling away. The gap is actually getting larger according to our data over time. So rather than the laggards learning, it seems more like the leaders are pulling away. Those are firms that understand what skills are needed in the future and position them. We have the data and we have the tools to identify what those skills are and position companies to where they need to be. So I'll close with the great Wayne Gretzky's comment that you need to skate to where the puck is going to be. We have a vision of machine learning becoming more important in the economy. It's going to transform many kinds of work and tasks. And the most successful firms are those that are using that knowledge to reinvent, retrain, reorganize their businesses. And if you'd like to learn more, the Stanford Digital Economy Lab, which I've been running for the past year up at Stanford, has all these papers online. You're free to download them and read them. And my own personal website has the research that I've been doing. So with that, let me just stop and say I'd love to take your questions and comments.
Hey, thank you, Erik. That was just absolutely wonderful. And to the audience, you know, we've been running the Center for Digital Transformation for coming on 10 years now. And if there's one talk that really sort of describes the scope of digital transformation, it was this one, because it's everything from how technology drives productivity, specifically zeroing in on super powerful technology and machine learning, but also the challenges therein, right? Which is we're seeing concentration of the skills to work with these technologies, and frankly, concentration of the use of the technology in some of these leader firms, for lack of a better phrase, to describe them, and some of the sort of the wrenching changes that are going to be affected by these technologies, because as Erik points out, the pie is not going to be split equally, and also some professions are going to be hurt more than others, but some are going to be benefited as well. And so, you know, when you look back 20 years from now, I think we're going to see a very different economy from the one we see today. And they just look back in time, and you know, so some of the things that we're doing today versus what we used to, how we did those same things. You know, the pandemic really brought these to the fore. I don't think I've ever watched as many Netflix movies in the last so many years than I have in the last year and a half, right? But with that, that's, you know, Erik, you've been described as a techno-optimist, and I share your optimism for the impacts of technology. And yes, there will be change. But the thing that I found most amusing about your optimism is you've actually taken a bet with probably the best known pessimist about technology, Robert Gordon. And he's a very rational superstar economist. And you've actually, I found on longbets.org that you have a $400 bet with him on whether productivity growth will exceed 1.8% over the next 10 years. You're on the overside of the bet. He's on the underside of the bet. Tell me what prompted that and what your thinking is and what his thinking is actually.
Bob's a dear friend. We've been having dinner every summer at the NBR Summer Institute. I've been to his house. He's been to my house. So we're good friends, and I respect very much his work, in particular his his book on the rise and fall of American productivity and American growth. Actually, I do disagree with him about his pessimism about the future. The Congressional Budget Office predicted that productivity for the next 10 years would be grow by 1.4%. So barely better than the 1.3% I showed you for the past 10 years. I think that's way low. So I gave Bob 4 points, brought it up to 1.8%. I'm taking the over on that. And there's really three reasons why I think that it's going to do a lot better. The first is this productivity J-curve. When I go out and look at the amazing technologies that are in our pipeline, I don't think it makes sense to just extrapolate from past productivity. You have to look at what's actually being invented. And there's been some effort to digest them, but the productivity J-curve, as I've shown and I've worked on, suggests that we're going to be coming to the upward part. But on top of that, that J-curve has been compressed a bit. The pandemic was a tragedy and hundreds of thousands of people died. At the same time, it also forced many companies to bring forward some of the digital investments that they had been contemplating, most notably, of course, working from home, where it went from 1 in 6 Americans working at home to in January of 2020 to 20 weeks later, about 50% of America, over 50% of America, according to some research I did with John Horton and others. And that's like the biggest transformation of the workforce since World War II, if not before. Not all of that's going to stay, but much of it is going to lead to more digitization and bring forward some productivity gains. And then last but not least, the US government has taken some different policies. For most of the previous 10 years, the economy ran way below capacity. Unemployment was above target. Inflation was below target. Both of those tell you that the Fed wasn't pushing hard enough to pump up the economy. The Congress wasn't pushing hard enough. Now, just starting this year or even last year, Congress and the Fed are pushing much harder to boost the economy. If anything, I think they may be pushing it too hard. We'll see, but they're definitely revving the economy up much faster. And that's going to lead to higher productivity growth too, as companies are forced to compete for workers and think harder about how they can get some productivity gains. You put those together, the technology and J-curve, the pandemic digitizing the country, and the federal strategies, and they all lead in the same direction towards significantly higher productivity growth.
You know, I used to be a betting man when I was in college and high school, and I think we should crowdsource you a bet and see how many people will line up on your side. I would, and see if we can.
Yeah, no, I think it's. I love the site, the long bets, because people can put their money where their mouth is. You guys can go. I think you can go comment on. I'm not sure, but you know, it's one thing to make predictions. It's another to put it on the record and. Bob and I want to do a dinner, but they wouldn't let us do a dinner. They said it had to be money, so that's fine. It's actually going to a charity. The money's going to a charity.
And it was interesting. Both sides are giving to the same charity, so there you go. It doesn't matter.
Yeah. The charity's going to win. That's the one thing we'll know will happen.
That's great. Some of the things that you talked about, so I agree with sort of your prediction, of course, but let's talk a little bit about the J-curve, because I think that's a fascinating concept, right?
Yeah.
And what you're trying to do, if I understand correctly, is you're capturing sort of the investment in organizational capital.
Yeah.
It takes a long time to invest in processes, bring your skills up to date, that they complement the technology and so on. But then you also said that you've got these superstar firms that are pulling ahead.
Right.
So is there an inherent contradiction in sort of, if these firms are pulling ahead and their leads are growing, and then let's forget the firms that are bottom of the barrel. Let's take even the firms that are somewhere in the median. Mm-hmm. How do they catch up? Like, what do they have to do to sort of acquire the skill sets and so on? Because there's a lot of fear about market concentration, right?
Well, these are two separate things. There's definitely a big investment happening in the economy. And that investment isn't showing up in GDP because we don't count business processes the way we count, say, factories. If Dell builds a second factory to double their production, that goes as GDP, more buildings, bricks and mortar. If they reinvent their existing factory using business process transformation, digital transformation, as your center does, they maybe get twice as much output that way, but that doesn't get recorded as a new asset. So there's a big measurement problem, and the J-curve captures that if we weren't having that measurement problem, we would know that productivity is not truly dipping. It gets measured as dipping. Now, this superstar effect shows that some firms are being much more aggressive about making these investments, and they're the ones that are reaping the gains. I think that it shows that it's actually kind of hard to do digital transformation. It's not something you can just do automatically, and it takes some very sophisticated, CEOs and CTOs, and I know that your center is helping to identify some of the practices that work better. For now, it seems like there's a relatively small group of executives who really get it and are delivering it. And when you go out and talk to companies, you realize that most of them really are puzzled by some of these technologies.
Yes.
My hope is that it'll become more widely understood. There was a time when electricity was puzzling to most factory owners, or even the steam engine. So it takes time for businesses to figure out how to use these technologies effectively. I wish it was happening faster, and I'm glad you and others are working on trying to shorten that gap.
It's sort of interesting because when you think about electricity, the way, no matter how old you are, you've taken a plug and put it into the wall socket the same way from the time you were born till today, right? Not hopefully when you were born, but soon thereafter. And the difference with things like machine learning or technology in general is the technologies keep evolving. And it's not just data sets and computing power, but it's also sort of the algorithms themselves are getting a lot better, as you pointed out, and with a sudden spike in the curve. I think it was Jeff Hinton's work that led that off.
He was really the leader, along with Jan LeCun and others in developing these deep learning techniques.
Which makes it really hard to sort of keep embracing this. And we're seeing some of this manifested even at all our various universities, because the demand for our programs and they all go by different names, but business analytics, whatever you want to call them, every business school that I can think of has launched these programs, and it's no trouble sort of filling them. We've got more requests at the Center for helping companies reskill their workforces around these technologies than we've ever seen. What do you see happening on I want to look at, before I turn it over, I have one last question for you. I'm curious to hear your sort of take on the workforce implications, because you sort of did a macro view of this, but this is going to be sort of it's a massive structural change, for lack of a better phrase.
Yes.
How do you sort of mitigate the impacts on workers and things like that?
Well, I may be biased, but one of the things I put near the top would be education and training. There is a race between technology and education that Jan Tinbergen described, and David Otters and others have elaborated on, that as technology races ahead, there are new skills that are needed, and we haven't been keeping up on that, or a lot of people haven't been keeping up. And so median wages have stagnated, and the gap has gotten bigger. And so I'd like to see us as a country and as companies and as individuals invest more in our skills and education. We also could do a better job with structuring business processes that kept people. I see there's a question or comment about augmenting versus automating. We could do a lot more to have humans and machines work together and keep humans in the loop. They can add a lot of value and stay indispensable, rather than looking for ways to replace humans and devalue their skills and get rid of their contribution. In most cases, I think you create more company for the business by augmenting rather than automating, but also I think you create a more balanced income structure. And then last but not least, I think we should do more just straight up income support. There are a lot of people who, for no fault of their own, their skills are more suitable for machine learning, and others who they're less so. And that kind of outcome, we could cushion it a lot, like we should have done with globalization and trade, through things like the earned income tax credit that supplements people's wages when they're working, even if the market isn't rewarding them as much. And then we could have people not falling as far behind as they otherwise would. And all those, I think, are things we could do. And there are others as well, but that's a good start.
Great. Let me turn it over to the audience. And we have a lot of questions, but I'm going to start with Mike Steigerwald. Because you've talked about this in your concept of GDPB, what metrics do you suggest we use to measure the benefits of technology such as Wikipedia, LinkedIn, and so on?
Sure. Well, I'll just get a tiny bit technical here. What GDP measures, the production cost of producing things and the market price of them. GDPB seeks to measure the consumer surplus. The consumer surplus is what you would have paid if you had to pay the most you would have paid versus what you actually paid. So if you would have paid $110 for a pair of sneakers and you only had to pay $80, you're getting $30 worth of consumer surplus there. And for the case of Wikipedia, maybe you would have paid $30 a month for that, or $3 a month, whatever the number is, and you're getting it for free. So what we did was we went out and we surveyed a whole bunch of people And in some cases, we enforce the service to say, what we have to pay you to say, give up Wikipedia or give up Facebook or give up other things. And then in some cases, we actually held them to that dollar amount and made it incentive compatible. So we got a whole demand curve of how much people were willing to pay. And so then you look at the area under the demand curve and you figure out what the total consumer surplus is. So, for Facebook, it's actually, tens of billions of dollars. Also for Wikipedia, some like Twitter, it wasn't nearly as valuable. Email, super valuable. So you start getting a sense of how valuable some of these things are by what you'd have to pay the people to stop using them.
Are there any sort of, thinking about, as you were talking, a couple of things. One is this, I thought of when you said it, I forgot to bring it up, was you talked about no drivers have been replaced by self-driving cars. But in the Bay Area alone, the DMV is now, the California DMV is actually licensed both Waymo and Cruise to do some amount of robotaxi. So it's right. closer than we.
Yeah, no, it's coming. I don't doubt that. But a lot of those, I haven't kept up on the very latest with Google, but for a while they had not just a safety driver in every car, driverless car, right. but they had a second safety driver watching the first one because I guess the job is so boring. Sometimes they would fall asleep. So that's two guys, two women, two people in the car, not one or zero. Now, I don't doubt at some point there will be, and there are some actually driverless trucks in Australia and a few others that are out far from inhabited areas. But for now, there's hundreds of billions of dollars of investment in driverless cars and related technologies, but we're not getting the consumer benefit. I'm not saying that's bad. I'm just saying that it takes time. You have to put the investment up front and then you get the return later.
Yeah, and we actually featured the chief product officer of PACCAR, a big trucking company, and they actually think the impact on trucking will be much more significant in the short run because, as he put it, every truck is a profit center.
Yeah, and so exactly. I mean, it could easily add 0.5% to GDP, just that one application.
Sure.
And to productivity growth, I should say, just that one application as they start coming online.
But just like you've got free goods, aren't there also some deflationary is not the right word, but to the extent that we went to a lot of movies, but a movie for a family costs, I don't know, $50-100 depending on how many people go and what concessions you buy versus a $15 subscription to Netflix.
Yeah.
And that's sort of a captured in consumer surplus. But
that is a big increase in consumer surplus. And so there's a huge amount of value being created there. And some of it's measured in GDP. Most of it, frankly, is not measured very well. Right. But that's a good example. And so there's so many of these digital goods that are creating a ton of value that we're missing. And so I think once we show that we're measuring things more carefully, we'd see that the productivity numbers are higher. The inflation numbers would be even lower than the official numbers.
There's a question here about sort of, can you talk about sort of wages? Is there a way of using wages to capture some of the effects of what's going on?
Well, it'll help get you a sense of the distributional effects, some of the winners and losers. It won't necessarily measure the total growth of the pie because a lot depends, as we were just talking about, how people are getting more free goods or low cost goods. So you really have to look both at, to look at the living standards, you have to look at both what a dollar will buy and how many dollars you get. You got to look at both sides of that.
Cool. My friend Donna Hoffman has a question, which is, it just flew off my screen here. Okay, hang on a second. Well, I
see it. The one from Steve Postrel. She's elaborating on that.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, first off, hi, Donna. So I'm glad you're at it. I guess we can't see each other. But yeah, this is a really important point: automation versus augmentation. And as she says, and I saying some of my writing, and others have said, it's very hard to get technology to go the entire way of doing things. But if you combine humans and machines together, they often can do much better. And Steve Postrel makes the point that for radiologists, it's not likely they're going to be replaced anytime soon by these technologies because there's so many things to do. And even in the narrow category of reading the images, there's the risk of false positives as well as false negatives. And I have a former grad student, Erik Brynjolfsson, who's looking at having the images read first by the machine and then by a human. And that does much better than the machine alone or the human would because they make different kinds of errors. So it's not just a matter of getting two sets of eyeballs on it. It's more a matter of getting some diversification. And then beyond that, as I said, I showed on my slide, there are a lot of other things that radiologists do. So this discussion of like all the radiologists are going to be replaced is a little bit too simplistic. Yes, they can do a very good job at recognizing some cancers that the radiologist wouldn't have recognized, but you still need humans in the loop for now. And I think that's a good description of most machine learning systems, at least for now. Over time, I can see that some of them become less important. So my advice to the managers is to, resist the temptation to try to have it completely soup to nuts automated, but rather look for opportunities for humans and machines to work together. And the humans are great at the long tail, the exceptional, the weird cases, and machines can do some of the routine, repetitive stuff. For most people, that's a good deal. They get relieved of sort of the repetitive stuff, and they get to work on the more interesting cases.
We have a paper that looks at predicting demand at theme parks. And it's a human in the loop AI approach where sort of the humans actually, with working alongside AI, and we actually break that down. We don't have time to get into that here, but there are ways, to your point, about how humans really complement machines. The example that stands out the most, so there's a lot of day-to-day ways in which humans help the machines do better. So during the pandemic, though, one of the things that was very interesting was the machines faltered because they hadn't seen, there was nothing in the data set to sort of indicate how demand can just crash.
Right.
But the humans actually remembered that Korea had dealt with other pandemics before and were able to incorporate more data in and sort of refer back to that as an analogous time. And that's an extreme event, but I thought it was interesting.
It's a good example because it's very typical that machines are great with machine learning, at least for now, maybe in the future it'll be better. They require large amounts of data and seeing things over and over. Humans, if you show a picture of an elephant to a toddler, once or maybe a couple of times, they quickly know what an elephant is. No machine learning system is that good yet. They will be perhaps soon, but for now, there's a real difference between what the machines can do well and what the humans can do well.
So there's a lot of questions that I'm going to group together. They're asking about two things. I think one is the soft skills, like what do humans bring to the table that machines don't? So that's there's a set of questions about that. And then the other set of questions related, I would say, is, well, what skills should we as aspiring executives or aspiring professionals of any sort, what should we be doing to prepare ourselves better for this digital economy?
Well, it makes sense to bundle those because you want to focus on the things that machines don't do well. Hal Varian has this saying, you want to be a scarce complement to something that's becoming abundant. So what machines are very good, as I mentioned, it's a place with a lot of data, repetitive information. Humans are better, I guess, in two broad kinds of categories. One is creativity. So, not just answering a question, but asking the right question, thinking outside the box. What is it we should be working on? So that may be in areas of scientific discovery, entrepreneurship, sophisticated art and literature. Those are things that humans are just much, much better at. And so that's great. Now, many people say, well, how many jobs are there in these professions? And there are some, but actually there's a much broader category where you don't have to have some brilliant insight necessarily, but you have to have high emotional intelligence where you can be successful. That's the other one that's very valuable. So humans have a superiority in connecting with other humans. And so in areas like childcare or elder care, in coaching, in persuasion, in leadership, negotiation, many kinds of sales, where there's like a personal interaction. So I can see there's a lot more room for jobs in those areas like coaching and helping and taking care of other people, where I wouldn't want like a robot soccer coach trying to give a pep talk to a group of 9-year-olds. It just wouldn't be the same. It might be funny, actually, come to think of it, it might be kind of funny the first time, but in general, I don't think a robot's going to have that ability to connect to humans or an AI system that the people have currently. So those emotional intelligence, caring areas are also very big, and it's a huge section of the economy. And then, as I suggested, you can combine them in different ways. So while many of the tasks of a job of a radiologist or doctor might get automated, maybe actually be that nurses become relatively more important because a lot of what nurses do aren't as easy. Actually, there's a third category that I should mention, but it's fading more rapidly, which is dexterity. So machines are actually pretty bad at just having the dexterity that humans do, picking up a dime or a pen or folding a shirt. These are things that people can do, but machines actually for now are pretty difficult, walking up a set of stairs. So for now, humans also have an advantage in those categories, but I see that one fading more rapidly than the other two.
Here's a big picture, somewhat provocative question. We've all read about, sort of some correlation between technology and inequality. Yes. What's your thought and predictions on whether these technologies are going to make us more or less egalitarian?
Yeah, well, that's actually up to us. It's a choice. So there's no law that says that technology is going to be widely shared, everyone's going to benefit. There's no law that says it's not going to be. And there have been times in history where we have seen that the income structure got more compressed. And it was a function partly of how the technologies were used. I just talked about humans and machines together. It's also a function of the social safety net, investments in education, and other things. That race between technology and education, sometimes education gets ahead. And in the 60s and 70s, actually, there were more college-educated people than the labor force was expecting. And so the gap between college and high school wages got compressed a fair amount. So, we can do policies that lead it either direction. I'd say with the path we've been on has been towards growing inequality, and that's the way a lot of technology is being used. But I wouldn't want people, I'm less likely to make a prediction. I mean, you call me a techno-optimist or an optimist, which, I guess a lot of people call me that. Let me modify that. I'd say I'm a mindful optimist or a conditional optimist. I'm optimistic if we do the right things, we can get not just productivity, but also shared prosperity. But I also think it's entirely possible that things could go really wrong, really awry. I'm not a blind optimist. I think the next 10 years, if we do things right, could be the best 10 years of human history. But if we do things wrong, it could be among the worst 10 years. And so I don't want to have complacency from a unconditional prediction. I'm going to make it conditional on what actions we take.
I think that's a really important point that I want to reiterate too, because one of the things we've started talking about at our center is not just leadership for a digitally driven world, which is the tagline for the school, but it's responsible leadership. And I want to, and responsibility means different things to different people. And I don't want to delve into this too much, but many of us watched the testimony of the Facebook executive who's now left Facebook, of course. But it's a great example. I mean, who's to know what the facts on the ground actually are, but at this point anyway. But it's clear that these technologies have the potential for both enormous good and considerable harm if you look at the claims that are being made on the effect of teens and mental health and so on. But when you sort of move into a world of just, the aggregation of a lot of individual algorithms, I think that, there's a lot of risk. But one of the things I like to say is we want to build a world that we want to live in, right? So I think that's...
Yeah, no, exactly. I think our values are actually becoming more and more important. I mean, at the end of my last book with Andy, I said these technologies are becoming more powerful, and that means we have more ability to change the world. And an implication of that, I think, is that our values matter more than before. Like when you can't really do anything, it doesn't matter so much what your values are. I guess, maybe it helps you internally. But when you can make these huge, in fact, potentially catastrophic changes to the world and the environment, it really matters. You need to think hard about what your values are and what goals you want, whether as a society or as a company or as an individual.
I want to hold up this book. It's awesome as the rest of the robots. It's a dog-eared copy that I've had since high school. And I'm sure you know the 3 laws of robotics. A robot may not injure a human being through inaction, allow a human being to come to harm, and so on. And there's the second law sort of reiterates, and the third, And to me, one of the most fascinating things about that is, and I keep it to remind me of what I keep it on my desk permanently, by the way, for what computers I should be doing. Right. And I think it's interesting. Sometimes I think when it's like we're losing sight sometimes, or not everybody, but many of us, I think, are focused on this. But it is important to remember sort of what society is all about and who it's intended to serve. And these technologies are incredibly powerful. I'm going to go back to a tactical question at some level. It's not really, I take that back. It's from Bruce Weber, who I think is our mutual friend.
Sure, if it's
if it's the same Bruce Weber, we don't know, right? I can't see.
Hi, Bruce.
Hi, Bruce. Yes. Is the SML variable exogenous in the sense that management cannot influence it, or can they organize work and outsource some of the sort of the more substitutable jobs to other firms?
Well,
so
that's a great question.
The problem in some way, right?
So the way we designed SML, it was meant to be what machine learning using current technology can do. So it is endogenous in the sense that technology is progressing over time, and you can steer technological progress to focus on some skills versus other skills. In fact, I'm writing a paper right now called The Turing Trap, which talks about the dangers of focusing too much on automating human skills as opposed to augmenting and creating new skills. But more fundamentally, the question is what management can do. And most managers aren't necessarily inventing new machine learning technologies. They're organizing their companies. And here again, there's an opportunity to do things in a way that are better or worse for your workforce. You can design things in such a way that you're using technologies that amplify workers, that create broadly shared prosperity, that tap into their creativity and leadership and coaching and the other things that I mentioned that humans are uniquely good at. Or you could try to descale and not take advantage of those. And I would say the second path not only is likely to lead to more broadly shared prosperity, but also experience shows has led to more and more value. Let me give you a quick little thought experiment. Suppose that 3,500 years ago, the Greeks had developed wonderful robots that could do everything that other Greeks were doing and eliminated all labor from the production of chariots and tunics and bloodletting and whatever else they were doing back in those days. The good news is they wouldn't have to work anymore and they would have all those things for free. The bad news is, let's face it, that would not really be anywhere near our living standard. Most of what we have is not from our chariots and tunics and bloodletting. It's from new things that were invented subsequently. So we've expanded our set rather than simply do the same things more cheaply. And the same thing applies, for businesses and for society. Let's think about expanding the set.
Yeah, to that point, it's really, at the end of the day, technological progress comes from the discovery of new know-how. Paul Romer has written a lot about this, and I think machine learning amplifies our ability to generate new know-how. So absolutely right. If you freeze at any point in time, you really don't make a lot of progress. I want to go to Chris Hughes's question because I think it's sort of been one of the downsides that we haven't touched on so far. Mm-hmm. AI is being used in nasty ways as well. And so what do you think about the emerging use of AI by hackers? So, you and I are both friends of Sinan Aral, and we were blown away by this deep fake image of him. So he runs the center at MIT that Erik yielded the position to him, I guess, by moving.
That's right. I passed the baton on.
Passed the baton.
Sinan was my PhD student. And now he's taking over the center, which is great.
But he was, there was a deep fake of him. Let me just tell the audience, where they actually have a very, very good movie of him selling a fake investment where the goal is to take your money from you. And he, and took a while for a whole bunch of us to target the platform, which I shall leave unnamed, to take it down. There's some real risks with some of these AI technologies like deepfakes, for example.
No, for sure. It's an arms race. And, the same technologies can be used by bad guys and are being used by bad guys. Sometimes they use them before good guys use them, and deep fakes is a perfect example where these GANs, where the AI systems learn how to improve themselves very rapidly by competing against themselves, have gotten frighteningly good. I've been working a lot with GPT-3, which can generate very plausible text stories. Even one Stanford student I was talking to said that she was having GPT help her write first chapters of her dissertation. So these are just amazingly powerful technologies. And of course, the cyber attacks is one that I worry about all the time, where we can have our financial system, our energy systems be taken down from malicious attacks. And so there's a war going on between different AI systems to see which can advance more rapidly. This is something that could make the world much more fragile than it was before. And I think most companies aren't investing enough time and energy into this. We do have a paper on cybersecurity hiring after data breaches. And what happens is after there's a data breach, a bunch of people get hired, not just in that firm, but in their competitors' firms. But you have to wonder why they weren't hired earlier, but they kind of closing the barn door after the horse is gone, as they say. We also have another paper on digital resilience showing that the companies that had made the investments in advance tend to be more robust to these kinds of shocks.
Yep, that would make sense. Do you see a lot of companies acquiring companies in the markets, businesses they want to go into, and then using the acquired capabilities to help the buyer accelerate transformation? So GM Cruise certainly comes to mind, but there's a lot of examples like that.
Yeah, no, that's good. Yeah, I see the paper from Leonard Lane. The question. This is, I think, one of the best ways to combine digital technologies with existing capabilities. So you have PE firms that are doing roll-ups. You have other big companies that may have a loyal customer base or some suppliers, but their core businesses could be done better with the aid of machine learning. And so rather than have a hot startup try to build up its entire business from scratch, you combine the two, and you have the old school company that's got a lot of these assets that can then be energized with the new technology. It's a very effective technique, and our at WorkHelix, we can kind of scan through the different companies' capabilities to see which ones might be most suitable to do that kind of thing.
And if you look at Pfizer and BioNTech, the collaboration, or that's an example. It's a partnership, a collaboration, not an acquisition, but they bring different sets of abilities to the party.
Well, that's a great analogy or example there, because in biotech and the pharmaceutical, that's been done for a long time, where you combine those two. And now with machine learning, we're seeing it happen in a lot of other industries as well.
I'm going to close with a question from Vallabh Samba Murthy, who's the dean of the Wisconsin School of Business, another friend of ours.
Hi, Samba.
Hey, Samba. Eric, it looks like you anticipate disruption of work where some skills will prosper, whereas others will be disintermediated. How do educators and business leaders prepare for this upheaval? It's a good place to end.
Well, I can answer that in two ways. The first one is what can we do to help people to develop the new skills? And one of the things I think we can do is use these technologies a lot more effectively. So I've been disappointed that at two universities, MIT and Stanford, which are in some ways, very leading edge. I love both universities, but many of my faculty colleagues have resisted putting more stuff online and using digital technologies. And I'm usually the one in the faculty meeting pushing for more of that. And I would have to say, of all the industries I'm looking at, education is one of the laggards rather than one of the leaders in terms of adopting these technology, and we could do a lot more to do that. And I guess the fear is that we ourselves may become increasingly disintermediated. So I think that there's a risk there, but there's also an opportunity to reinvent how education is done. We could reach a lot more people at a lot lower cost, and we could actually personalize education a lot more by leveraging it with technology. I don't think it's necessary for hundreds of intro biology teachers or economics teachers to all teach the same lecture notes and reinvent the wheel. You could have some rock stars, maybe some Hollywood production values to really make physics or chemistry exciting, with a team of really good academics, make sure that it was academically rigorous, spend a few $1 million to do it in a very engaging and personalized way, and then flip the classroom so that humans spend more time with coaching and advising, and not as much time, delivering lectures to big rooms. But that's one particular model, and I kind of like that one. But the meta lesson, I think, is not any particular model is going to be better, but that we should do some more experimentation. The successful digital companies, especially in Silicon Valley, but all over the world, do a lot of A/B tests. And maybe that model I just described is going to work super well, or maybe it'll work well for some students and some topics. And maybe there are others that will work better. But the idea is to have enough digital data that you can rapidly learn and test what's working and what's not working. We should be doing that as educators ourselves, and we should be teaching the companies we work with to do that more effectively, so they can also get in this accelerated scale. And if we do that, I think over time, we're going to have not just a higher level of productivity, but a higher growth rate of productivity. And that's going to give us the resources to solve not just economic problems, but also some of the social, health, and environmental challenges that we face as well.
I wrote a piece for Forbes that talked exactly about how we can personalize and scale, think about education the way we think about software scalability, reusability. I did a calculation one time. We probably teach across the University of California 100 sections of Intro to Accounting.
Wow.
Every single year. and look at and each time somebody gets paid to stand in front of a class and teach that class, and obviously not everybody can be the best. But with that, I want to thank you for your time and thank you for an absolutely scintillating discussion of what AI means for everybody, because productivity at the end of the day is what drives GDP and what that drives the wealth of a country. And so prosperity is at the very heart of what we're talking about. Once again, thanks to our sponsors, KPMG and the Beal Family Foundation. Thank you really sincerely, Erik. We really appreciate you being here and sharing your expertise and your experience with us. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. We look forward to seeing you at our next event. Take care, everybody.